The wind on the mountain pass was not a sound you could ignore. It was a physical threat, a screaming white void that swallowed the light and the silence alike. In that furious tempest, a lone figure knelt, his breath freezing instantly in the sub-zero air, his focus locked onto the grim reality of what lay half-buried in the snow. A brass sheriff's star, still pinned to the coat of an unconscious woman, blood staining the pristine white powder. That badge wasn't just metal. It was the symbol of protection for an entire family of rural towns, and seeing it, shattered here on the edge of catastrophe, signaled a disaster far greater than a simple weather emergency. Jake Mercer, the man who found her, knew in his gut this wasn't an accident. This was a direct, calculated attack on the heart of the community's justice system. What happened next? The desperate signal from a loyal K9 and the instantaneous, unflinching courage of a retired tracker became the only thing standing between these thousands of lives and total communication blackout during the worst storm in years. This story is a testament to the quiet, fierce honor that still runs through the veins of this country. Tell me, friend, where are you watching from tonight? Let me know your city or country in the comments. We need to remember stories like this. The mountain pass didn't just have a blizzard, it had a whiteout, a vast, suffocating blanket of noise and ice where the world narrowed down to the space immediately in front of your face. The wind wasn't a breeze, it was a screaming freight train tearing through the pines, demanding silence from anyone foolish enough to defy it. When you're caught in this kind of fury, you learn quickly that sight is useless, and all you have left is instinct, and the bitter knowledge that nature doesn't care much for your schedule or your life. Jake Mercer moved through it like a ghost who remembered what it was like to be flesh. He was a retired search and rescue tracker, a man who traded the frantic pace of emergency response for the quiet rhythm of solitude. He carried the weight of the mountains in his shoulders, the kind of quiet courage that doesn't boast, but simply persists. He knew this terrain, but tonight the pass felt different, malicious, testing the very limits of human endurance against the raw, unadulterated power of the storm. Every step was a commitment, a deliberate push against the invisible wall of wind and blowing snow. His gaze was fixed downwards, searching for any break in the monotony of white, any sign that he wasn't entirely alone in this howling void. The cold wasn't external, it had seeped into the marrow, demanding a decision, retreat to warmth or continue forward, trusting that the training etched into his bones would see him through. It's in moments like these, when the odds are stacked against the decent folks, that we remember the kind of silent strength that keeps the world turning. The people who choose duty over comfort, who understand that justice requires vigilance even when the lights are out. If their kind of commitment resonates with your own beliefs about honor and community, then take a moment, hit that subscribe button, and join us in recognizing the true guardians of this land. His heavy, insulated boot plunged into a snowdrift, a step like 1,000 others, but this time the impact registered with a hard, unfamiliar thud. The sound was wrong. It carried the metallic resistance of something solid beneath, the soft, forgiving pack. In the roaring darkness, such a precise abnormality was like a gunshot to the seasoned eye. Jake stopped, the sound of the wind suddenly dropping away into a pressurized silence in his mind. He knelt slowly, fighting the urge to rip the snow away frantically. Trackers move with precision, knowing that haste can destroy evidence or exacerbate an injury. Using the stiff cuff of his glove, he gently brushed the crystalline powder from the obstruction. The light from his headlamp, weak as it was in the blizzard, reflected off a smooth, curved surface that carried the distinct texture of polished brass. Then he froze. It wasn't just metal, it was a badge. The star of the county, stylized and serious, catching the meager light. It was an unmistakable symbol of authority, responsibility, and the covenant of honor sworn to the community. Finding that star half buried here in the throat of the storm delivered a shock that was colder than the air itself. Brushing away more snow, the terrible reality took shape. The badge was still affixed to a heavy winter coat, which covered the still unmoving form of a person. It was Sheriff Dalton, known throughout the county not just for her strict adherence to the law, but for the quiet strength and commitment she showed to every family in her jurisdiction. Seeing her this vulnerable was like seeing the foundation of the county crack. She was unconscious, her face unnaturally pale against the snow, and a dark stain was spreading slowly, almost reluctantly, into the pristine white fabric near her temple. Jake didn't need a medical degree to know the situation was critical. The cold was a secondary threat. The primary one was internal, bleeding out onto the mountainside while the storm raged around them, sealing their fate. The sudden shift in perspective was profound. He wasn't just fighting the weather anymore. He was racing against time, against the elements, and against whatever invisible threat had brought this woman of courage down. This wasn't a mere accident. Deputies don't just wander off the trail and collapse, not the good ones, not the guardians. He knew then that Sheriff Dalton had been on mission, pursuing a problem that transcended broken bones and concussions. She was out here to protect the community family from a deeper, unseen threat. The badge wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a silent scream for help, a sign that the county's first line of justice was broken, and now he was the only one standing in the breach. But as Jake began the difficult task of assessing her injuries, a single agonizing question pierced the roar of the wind, pulling his focus away from the bleeding woman. Where was Ember, the K9 partner known to never leave her side, and what further terrible secret did their sudden disappearance hold? The scene Jake had stumbled upon was not the beginning of the story, but the desperate frozen middle. To understand the gravity of the sheriff's position, to grasp the true courage required to be out on this mountain in the first place, we have to rewind the clock a few hours, back to when the sky was merely threatening, not actively trying to bury them alive. Sheriff Dalton and Ember, her German shepherd partner, had been tracking a specific escalating threat to the peace of their rural family of counties. This wasn't about petty larceny or a drunken disturbance. The string of break-ins they were investigating had become increasingly sophisticated and targeted, focused not on cash or jewelry, but on remote utility sheds and, crucially, high-altitude repeater stations. Someone was systematically dismantling the county's emergency infrastructure, a sinister plot designed to ensure that when the next inevitable crisis hit, the entire network of help, from fire response to medical evacuation, would collapse. Dalton, a woman who understood the subtle difference between law enforcement and true justice, knew the stakes. These acts were calculated to exploit the vulnerability of a tight-knit community, ensuring chaos and fear. She chose to forgo the large, slow search party and took Ember up the pass herself, knowing that the K9's highly trained nose was the fastest, most reliable tool to find the specific location where the sabotage was being initiated. Honor demanded swift, silent action. Ember, a dog whose loyalty was a living, breathing testament to the bond between human and animal, was the perfect partner. Her training wasn't just obedience. It was a pact of mutual protection. She worked the high trail, sniffing through the damp earth and sparse pine needles, her senses sharper than any human radar, pulling Dalton toward the critical point before the massive storm front already visible on the horizon could close in and cut off their path. They'd reached a crucial point on the ridge, the air thick with the smell of ozone and the subtle, sharp scent of disturbed earth and metal that Ember instantly registered. It was a lead so strong it practically radiated intent. Dalton pulled out her radio to relay the coordinates, feeling the first icy drops of the incoming storm lash against her face, knowing they had only minutes before the weather shifted from troublesome to lethal. But the mountain has its own unpredictable temper. They say a blizzard gives you warnings, but a true whiteout can strike like a coiled snake. One moment the wind was a fierce challenge. The next, it was an avalanche of horizontal ice and snow, roaring with the sound of 1,000 demons let loose. It didn't just change the weather, it fundamentally changed the landscape in a matter of seconds. The force of the wind, compressed and amplified by the narrow pass, hit them with the physical weight of a vehicle collision. Dalton was thrown violently off her feet, tumbling down a steep, rocky embankment, partially concealed by fresh snow. The world became a kaleidoscope of white and grey, punctuated by the sharp, sickening impact of stone on bone. The sheriff was out before she even stopped rolling. Ember, however, performed the ultimate act of courage and devotion. Even as she was battered by the icy debris, The dog instinctively threw her body downhill, attempting to buffer her handler's fall, taking the worst of the impact across her own flank and shoulder. She didn't flee the danger, she ran straight into it, fulfilling her oath of protection above all else, an unspoken justice only a K9 truly understands. The storm, having done its worst, began the slow, terrible process of burying the evidence. Ember, dazed and nursing a deep bruise or worse, on her leg, was temporarily overwhelmed, disoriented by the sheer volume of snow that suddenly covered the ground. She whined, scrambling through the freshly piled drifts, trying desperately to reach the motionless figure of her handler, her whole world reduced to the scent of the woman who was her family. Hours passed, measured only by the accumulating snow and the slow drop in temperature. Ember managed to partially uncover Dalton, licking her face, nudging her, trying to elicit any response, but the sheriff remained still. The dog's heart broke, but its training held. Find shelter or signal. Yet the sheer depth of the whiteout made external signal impossible, leaving only the grim, silent wait. This is the kind of unrelenting loyalty that defines this job, this calling. It's what separates the badge from the person, the honor that lives beyond the injury. Ember lay huddled close, her body trembling, but refusing to retreat, the silent guardian waiting for a miracle in the dark. It was that refusal, that fierce commitment to the bond, that would ultimately be the county's only hope. And so we return to the present moment, where Jake Mercer stood over the sheriff, the terrible question of the missing K9 hanging in the air. Would fate truly allow such devotion and justice to be extinguished by the cold? Jake Mercer had knelt beside a dozen grim scenes in his life, but none felt quite as desolate as this. The heart of the county's justice lying broken and bleeding, entombed in ice. He was focused intensely on stabilizing the sheriff's head and assessing the deep cut near her temple, operating on pure mechanical training, blocking out the screaming wind. But even in that pressurized focus, the silence where a working dog should be was a gaping hole in the narrative. Then, faint, almost entirely swallowed by the shriek of the whiteout, a sound managed to pierce the noise. A low, muffled whimper. It wasn't the sound of the wind or the snow settling. It was the sound of pain, effort, and profound desperation. It was animal, injured, and close. Jake instantly pivoted, sweeping his headlamp across the nearby drifts, his heart catching in his throat. This sound was the first whisper of courage in a scene dominated by defeat. Through the swirling powder, he saw movement, a slow, agonizing disruption in the smooth expanse of snow about 10 feet away. A large, dark shape was emerging, dragging itself forward, fighting every inch of resistance the ice offered. It was Ember, the K9. She wasn't walking. She was crawling, her powerful back legs digging for purchase, while her front right paw hung limp, clearly injured from the brutal fall and her act of selfless protection. Ember's eyes, normally sharp and commanding, were clouded with exhaustion and pain, but focused entirely on Jake. She didn't bark, she didn't growl. She simply strained toward him, a beacon of loyalty in the storm. This dog was not merely reacting, she was implementing her training, driven by an inherent sense of honor that transcended species. Dragging her body across the punishing surface, she reached the edge of Sheriff Dalton's still form. She nudged her handler's boot once, a soft, anxious sound escaping her throat. Then, with a profound effort that Jake instantly recognized as a trained response, Ember lifted her good paw and weakly tapped the reflective material of Dalton's tactical vest right over her heart. It was a precise, trained distress cue, used only when the handler was completely incapacitated and external help was detected. That tap was a hammer blow to Jake's mind. It wasn't just a sign of life, it was communication. Ember wasn't just a dog lost in the storm, she was a witness and a participant in a crisis. The tap confirmed that Dalton wasn't simply stranded, she was down mid-mission, and the dog knew the urgency hadn't faded just because the weather turned. They were racing the clock to stop something critical. The sheer courage of the animal, injured and freezing, yet prioritizing the mission over her own survival, redefined the entire situation for Jake. This wasn't a rescue, it was a continuation of an ongoing act of justice. He was no longer just tending to a casualty. He was the final piece of the puzzle, suddenly drafted into the sheriff's sworn duty to protect the county family. The K9's signal, weak as it was, carried a moral clarity that cut through the storm. Whatever Dalton was chasing was still active, still a threat, and still needed to be stopped before the blizzard sealed off every exit and every means of communication. If they failed to act immediately, the disaster Dalton was trying to prevent would unfold unchecked, crippling the county at its most vulnerable moment. Jake looked from the tapped vest to the dog's resolute, aching eyes. He gave Ember a soft, acknowledging nod, a silent vow of honor between two guardians. "I see you, girl. I hear you." He understood the mission now. The fate of the surrounding towns, the safety of countless family members relying on emergency systems, rested on the information Ember had just transmitted. But the mountain was a clock counting down. With every passing second, the likelihood of rescue dropped, and the power grid and communication infrastructure they were out here to protect grew more vulnerable. The question was, what had Dalton found before she fell, and how far away was the critical threat that still demanded their attention? Jake took a moment to gently wrap Ember in a spare thermal blanket, acknowledging her sacrifice with a silent touch that conveyed both respect and a promise of aid. The pain in her paw was clear, yet the dog's gaze remained fixed uphill, a clear directional hint that Jake dared not ignore. He was operating now not just on his own skills, but on the silent, unwavering intelligence of the K9, who held the key to the sheriff's last actions. Trusting that primal connection, Jake began traversing the steep slope immediately above where the sheriff lay. He moved slowly, deliberately pushing the heavy snow aside with his boots and gloved hands, looking for anything that suggested struggle or a focused investigation. The storm made tracking nearly impossible, but he was looking for disturbance, not prints, the subtle sign that a person had been stationary, examining something. Just 10 yards up, partially shielded by a cluster of icy boulders, he found it, a slight unnatural break in the snow's surface, as if a large object had recently been pulled from its drifts. He dug rapidly, the cold metal burning his hands through his gloves. Under the snow, he uncovered a standard heavy-duty emergency relay box, bolted into the rock face, a crucial link in the county's communication infrastructure. This wasn't just any utility box. This was the high-altitude nerve center responsible for routing 911 calls, coordinating rescue frequencies, and, critically, broadcasting localized weather alerts for the dozens of remote communities that constituted the county family. The box was old, rugged, and meant to withstand the elements, yet the heavy steel door was hanging half open, wrenched violently from its main lock. Jake shined his lamp inside, and the cold reality of the sabotage hit him with sickening force, confirming Dalton's worst fears. Several thick, color-coded communication lines had been neatly, professionally severed. This wasn't vandalism. This was highly technical, targeted destruction. And nestled among the cut wires, glowing with a malevolent, insistent rhythm, was a small foreign electronic device blinking an angry, pulsing red light. If this site, of systems designed to protect the vulnerable, being actively dismantled by unseen enemies, stirs a deep sense of moral outrage in your heart, then take a moment. If you believe in the necessity of quiet justice and the defense of the defenseless, comment justice down below. Your affirmation matters in this ongoing struggle for honor. The blinking red device was clearly a timer or a trigger set to complete the sabotage. It was designed to knock out communication across the entire county, a catastrophic level of damage timed perfectly to coincide with the apex of the whiteout. With all roads blocked and visibility gone, the total collapse of the 911 system, rescue coordination, and critical weather warnings would leave thousands isolated and vulnerable, especially the elderly and those living in remote family farms. The sheriff hadn't fallen by chance. She had been inspecting this box, likely surprised while working, or perhaps struck by the sudden localized avalanche of ice triggered by the storm right after she found the device. She was trying to prevent a mass catastrophe, a profound act of courage that had cost her dearly. The enemy wasn't the storm was the shield for the true threat. Jake looked down the slope at Ember, still struggling to comfort her handler, the epitome of honor and loyalty. and then back up at the blinking red light. The device was counting down, silent and fast. He was a tracker, not a technician, and attempting to tamper with it could accelerate the catastrophic failure. His only option was immediate high-speed communication. The urgency was now palpable, crushing. If the relay failed, no one would know where the sheriff was or that thousands of lives were in peril. He had to prioritize getting help for Dalton and Ember, while simultaneously sounding the alarm about the existential threat of the sabotage device. The two missions were now inextricably linked, separated only by the fast-draining battery life of the timer. He understood the weight of the moment. The fate of the community family hinged on his next series of decisions. He couldn't fix the wires, but he could save the link. He gathered his courage, knowing the worst of the storm was still ahead, and descended the slope, preparing to become the link between the fallen sheriff's mission and the county's survival. The true moment of decision arrived when Jake looked at the unconscious sheriff and the injured K9. He couldn't leave them, and he couldn't stay. To stop the sabotage and save them both, he needed to move. Working with the desperate efficiency born of emergency experience, he utilized his heavy-duty, weather-resistant ground, tarp and ropes to fashion a makeshift emergency sled, stabilizing Dalton onto it with careful precision, protecting her head injuries as best he could against the brutal jolting of the Whiteout. He then turned to Ember, who watched him with trusting, intelligent eyes. He pointed toward the general direction of the hidden ranger outpost, a barely functional shelter he knew was a mile down the ridge, and gave a low, firm command. Ember, despite the throbbing pain in her forepaw, immediately understood. Her honor demanded compliance, and her courage overruled her pain. She adjusted her weight and began to lead, limping but unwavering, a living compass pointing the way to safety. The trek through the height of the Whiteout was a brutal test of human and animal endurance. Jake pushed the heavy sled, leaning into the wind that screamed its opposition to their journey. His vision reduced to the bobbing, focused silhouette of Ember ahead. Every agonizing step was fueled by the knowledge of the ticking red light waiting back at the relay box, the silent threat to every family in the valley below. Finally, after what felt like an eternity compressed into 20 minutes, the vague shape of the small, Stone Ranger outpost materialized in the storm's chaos. It was unlocked, and mercifully, the emergency radio was functional. Jake moved Dalton inside, stabilizing her further, and then, ignoring the deep burn in his own lungs and muscles, he reached for the microphone. His voice, usually calm and measured, was tight with urgency as he broke through the static to the county dispatch. He didn't waste a second on unnecessary explanation. "This is Jake Mercer, High Pass Ridge. I have Sheriff Dalton down, serious injury, but listen, the emergency relay is compromised. Sabotage. Red blinking device set to cut communications. I repeat, imminent system collapse." The precision of his alert cut through the initial panic on the other end. Within minutes, the county response machine roared into life. Emergency medical teams were dispatched immediately, despite the storm, targeting the Ranger outpost coordinates. As the crews battled the elements to reach them, Jake's secondary task began, securing Ember. The loyal K9, refusing to be treated before her handler, settled herself protectively against Dalton's unmoving side, a final, fierce act of courage and devotion. When the medical team arrived, they stabilized Dalton, but Jake was already moving. He handed off the medical responsibilities, gave precise directions to the downed relay box, and volunteered to guide the specialist communications technicians back up the treacherous slope. He wasn't law enforcement, but his quiet adherence to the principle of justice made him the county's necessary guardian that night. Guided by Jake, the technicians reached the compromised relay, the red light still blinking mercilessly. Because of his timely, specific alert, they had brought the exact neutralization tools needed. Working frantically against the clock, they disabled the explosive device and repaired the severed wires, restoring the integrity of the communication system minutes before the planned total blackout would have engulfed the valley, protecting thousands of citizens and their family from utter isolation. As the first faint light of dawn, a pale, exhausted pink, began to penetrate the receding storm clouds, Sheriff Dalton was being loaded onto a heavy-duty transport sled for evacuation. Her eyes fluttered open, finding Jake Mercer standing nearby, covered in ice and exhaustion. She didn't have the strength to lift her hand, but she managed a weak, rasping whisper of thanks. Jake simply nodded, his duty done. He knew that the sheriff was alive, her honor intact, and the county safe because of a canine's desperate signal and a stranger's unwavering instinct for what was right. The storm had broken, but the invisible bonds of community justice remained, stronger than the ice. What is the price of silence? What is the true measure of a community's honor when the only person standing between chaos and order is an injured dog and a solitary man who thought his days of tracking were behind him? We often mistake justice for the large, loud pronouncements of a courtroom, but sometimes it is the quiet, decisive action taken in the blinding cold when no one is watching that truly saves the day. Jake Mercer didn't seek accolades. He simply acted on a code of deep-seated courage. He saw the sheriff struggle and heard the dog's desperate communication, and he chose to shoulder the burden of protecting the thousands of people who constitute our extended family. That is the kind of moral accountability that should define us. Ask yourself honestly, when the storm descends, literal or metaphorical, and the systems we rely on fail, do you have the moral clarity to step into the breach? Are you prepared to put duty and the safety of others above your own comfort and security? The world needs more guardians, people who understand that integrity is measured by what you defend when the lights go out. If this story reminds you of the quiet heroes in your own life, the people who show up and do the right thing without fanfare, then I ask you to join our community. Hit that subscribe button. Let's keep recognizing the true depth of human honor and the constant need for selfless courage, because the law can be written on paper, but justice must always be written in the heart.